This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 746 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thank you for tuning in. This is your final reminder about pre-ordering the Late Round Prospect Guide. It drops on Monday, and when it drops, that price is going to rise to $14.99. Right now, it's $11.99. The guide is 130 plus pages long and includes information about what goes into my prospect models. There are profiles of every running back and wide receiver who are at this year's combine, and you get scores for all those players too. Once the NFL draft is over, you'll get an updated guide to your email with new profiles and updated scores. There's also an entire section dedicated to my Year 2 model. The Year 2 model looks at second-year players in the NFL to determine how well they're going to perform in Year 2 and Year 3. So you'll know what to do in Dynasty with guys like Jahan Dotson or Tyler Algier. Head to lateround.com and pre-order right now before it launches on March 13th. The first question this week is from Twitter. It's from @jswan_NYI. It says, you recently posted excellent weight data for running backs, noting 210 as a good cutoff. How does your model compensate for changes in the game and how players are valued, e.g., increased importance of running back catches prioritizing agility over weight, greater emphasis on draft capital? So I want to be clear about something. That cutoff that I used when talking about Jahmyr Gibbs on Tuesday's show, or what I tweeted earlier this week, that was just in reference to Gibbs and the other smaller running backs in this year's class. My model does not look at Jahmyr Gibbs and say, you're not 210 pounds, you're out. In fact, BMI is the weight input in the model, so technically, Gibbs isn't getting dinged at all. Generally speaking, draft capital is going to reflect all of this. A back who's less than 200 pounds like Gibbs usually doesn't get drafted early. Since 2011, the only running backs to come in under 200 pounds and get drafted in the top 64 were Isaiah Pead, Michael James, and James Cook. So Gibbs is unique for that reason alone. He still looks really good in my model, though. He's got a shot to be over the 95th percentile, which is a mark that elite running backs tend to hit. It's just that when I'm analyzing these prospects, I'm pointing out red flags that they might have to their profile. And for Gibbs, even when you expand that weight profile by 10 whole pounds, the hit rates for those running backs have historically not been very good. It doesn't mean I'm fading him or I don't like him. I'm not saying that's what you're saying here or anything, but I do think that when I tweet things like that out, or when I say things like that on this podcast, the assumption is that I'm fading that player. That's why I threw the caveat out there that he's still my RB2. There's just concern to his profile. And I'd argue that concern is a bigger concern than something like a slightly below average touchdown share. Now, the focus of your question is on how the model adjusts for the game changing, with these running backs who are smaller becoming more and more fantasy relevant, or at least being used more and more at the NFL level. And honestly, this same question gets asked every single year. And every year, we're not seeing smaller running backs take over fantasy football. It's just not happening. Just look at recent history. Over the last 3 years, we've had 51 instances where a running back averaged 14 or more PPR points per game with a minimum 8 games played. So 17 running backs per year on average are getting to 14 or more PPR points per game. Obviously, we're going to have some repeats here. And we do. Only 28 of those running backs are unique. So we have 28 unique running backs who have scored 14 or more PPR points per game over the last 3 seasons. 23 of the 28 backs were 210 plus pounds. The 5 who weren't were Aaron Jones, who was 208, Myles Gaskin, who was replaced as starter, Christian McCaffrey, Elijah Mitchell, who was replaced as starter, and Austin Eckler. My prospect model loved Aaron Jones and Christian McCaffrey because they were insanely productive in college. McCaffrey's one of the best running backs in the model, and Aaron Jones has the highest draft capital delta of any running back in the model's history, meaning it viewed Aaron Jones as the most underrated running back versus draft capital. And then Austin Eckler's just not in the model because he didn't go to the NFL Combine and he wasn't drafted. So obviously, I don't think the model needs fixing. And for the record, I test things every single year. But the bottom line is that good running backs will show up. And Gibbs is a good running back. He still looks good in the model. But even when you adjust for the fact that there are just fewer small backs entering the league, They still aren't providing a ceiling in fantasy football at the same rate as bigger backs are. The ratio still favors the 210 plus pound backs. And a lot of people wouldn't even consider that big. 210 pounds is not necessarily massive. But generally speaking, that's where we see fantasy production come from. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Josh. It says, thanks for all the amazing work. As an owner of the 102 in a standard league, you're scaring me with your Gibbs info. What teams are a perfect fit for him that might make you a little bit more comfortable? I think Gibbs is much, much more attractive in PPR than standard. His bread and butter is receiving. And while receiving does matter in standard, targets are worth more than attempts even in a standard league. It's going to be easier for him to be a difference maker in a PPR format. And that's the assumption that I work under with these prospects, that you're playing in a PPR league. Now, with that being said, I think a pass catching back like Gibbs can pretty much work anywhere. A place like Miami would be great. I will say that I hope a place with a mobile quarterback is not his destination, because mobile quarterbacks generally limit receiving upside for running backs. That's what I talked about on episode 510 about a year and a half ago. So you want him to avoid a spot with a mobile quarterback, but honestly, I'd be more concerned about the format that you're playing in. People think PPR matters more at wide receiver, but it matters more at running back, at least within the position. When you're talking flex, it's a little bit different. Because at running back, you can see larger differences in receptions from player to player. That delta is larger. And Gibbs is not my 102 right now. I have him at 103 in single quarterback leagues. My 102, Jackson Smith and Jigba. This next question is from @PE918Sammy. It says, what are your thoughts on the Saints skill players after the Derek Carr deal? Does this give them a boost in Dynasty? My reaction to the deal was that it at least gives them some stability at quarterback in the short term. Now that stability is not Aaron Rodgers, but it's not this up in the air situation that they were in before. Carr hasn't been the most aggressive down the field thrower throughout his career. And that's somewhat of a concern with players on that Saints team who can stretch the field. But he's gotten better at pushing it the last few seasons. Last year with Davante Adams in the mix to open up that offense a bit, he threw it 15 or more air yards at a 20.3% rate. That was the 6th highest in the NFL among quarterbacks with 300 or more attempts. He's also been okay enough accuracy-wise on those throws. The league average completion percentage on those 15-plus air yard throws last year was about 43%. He was a little over 40%, and he's been above 40% in each of his last 5 seasons, sometimes well above 40%. And look, guys, the alternative here is Andy Dalton. Dalton's completion percentage on those 15-plus air yard throws has been below 40% in each of his last 3 seasons. And he's pushed it 15-plus air yards at a below-average rate, too. So this is a bump for everyone. It's not as big of a bump as it could have been, but you should feel better about Saints offensive players with Derek Carr. This next question is from @AlphaPisces. It says, how would you approach Diontae Johnson? Is he a good bet to produce more efficiently going forward? I think Johnson is probably more of a buy than a sell right now. He's a good player, a very good player. Over the last 2 seasons, there have been 5 wide receivers who were able to hit a target share per game rate above 27% in both seasons. So they were at 27% in 2021 and in 2022. Davante Adams is one. Cooper Kupp is another. So is DJ Moore and Justin Jefferson. As is Diontae Johnson. As long as he's healthy, he's going to see favorable regression in the touchdown column. And the Steelers were a whole lot better offensively during the second half of the season last year than the first half. And we saw both Johnson and George Pickens get an uptick in yards per route run as a result. I know people like to talk down about Diontae because he hasn't been the most efficient wide receiver in the world, but he gobbles up targets. That's a talent thing. You don't see that much work while being a below average or an average wide receiver. And he's now done this with multiple quarterbacks, you guys. We want to buy good players in Dynasty, and I think that Diontae Johnson is a good player. The last question this week is from @TVan15. It says, can you share your thoughts on Jameson Williams for next year and going forward? So the hard part about Jameson Williams is that we haven't really seen this type of situation work out in recent history. My year 2 model looks at a player's prospect score, some inputs from their rookie season, and tries to predict how well that player is going to do in year 2 or year 3. Clearly, because Williams didn't play that much last year, his year 2 score doesn't look very good. But then I sat back and I thought about this, And it kind of makes sense as to why it wasn't good, as to why that number doesn't look very favorable. Let me read you the first round pick since 2011 who played single-digit games in year one. John Ross, Josh Doxson, Kevin White, Brashad Perriman, AJ Jenkins, Laquan Treadwell, and Jameson Williams. None of them got going after they didn't play that much as rookies. I'm not saying all of their situations are the same. I'm not saying Jameson Williams is a bust. But it does put a little bit of fear in your mind. I also have this from Williams' profile in this year's prospect guide. It's in the year 2 model section of the guide. It says, with that being said, I've got to at least state what the numbers say. Among the 49 year 2 model wide receivers in the 70th to 80th percentile, only 2 were able to give us a season in year 2 or year 3 with 10 or more PPR points per game. Now, fortunately, one of those players was Mike Williams, who dealt with some injury issues of his own to start his career. But just based on what we've seen in that alone, Williams is a little bit scary. Jameson Williams, that is. And I know that you can point to Travis Etienne last year and say that if you took a conservative approach with him, you were burned. But running back is different than wide receiver. The year 2 model is looking at projecting year 2 and year 3. If it takes longer for wide receivers to get acclimated to the NFL level, then it would make sense that the year 2 score for a wide receiver is more meaningful than what we saw with Travis Etienne. Now, this whole entire take could burn me, but I think Williams is not someone I'm going to aggressively be going after this offseason. I wouldn't be surprised at all if he's great. He was a 95th percentile prospect in my prospect model, and that's where great prospects land. I think overall, though, given his journey, I just think he's a hold. I don't think he's this aggressive buy. We may not be able to see it right now, but there is risk to his profile overall. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out LateRound.com, pre-order the prospect guide because it does drop on Monday. Enjoy your weekend, everyone. I'll talk to you next week.